Good morning, everybody. Good morning again. Good morning, and welcome to the first ever Right to Research in Africa conference. It is such an honor to be welcoming you all and being part of something that we bring together policymakers, researchers, and experts from around the continent to talk about important topics to do with the right to research. So thank you all so much for being here. It's going to be a week of incredible discussions and growth and insights. And just a few quick admin notes again. If everyone could please put their phone on silent or switch it off. And also hello to everybody on Zoom. If everyone on Zoom could please pin this image so that you're able to see the speakers as your primary image. And then let's get straight into it because we're running a little bit late. I would like to introduce the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawana Kupe. He has quite a history of accolades and achievements, especially in media and humanities, and has been instrumental in bringing connecting UP to other organizations and universities and experts around the world, and has been very focused on research. So it's very wonderful that he's here today to give us our opening welcoming speech. If we could give a little clap. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. A very good morning, everyone, and compliments of the not so new year. So in the interest of time, I'll not go through the protocol welcomes. I'll just say all protocol observed, and you are very welcome to the University of Pretoria. Fellow academics, policy makers, members of foundations, community organizations, and knowledge activists, continental brothers and sisters, and international brothers and sisters, we welcome you to what promises to be an extraordinary week of debates on copyright and access to knowledge, taking place at the University of Pretoria, followed by the University of Cape Town. The pursuit of knowledge and research is at its heart about developing human consciousness, awareness, and the ability to live in our shared planet, as well as to better understand our universe and our place in it. Where better to have this conference than in the cradle of consciousness and humankind? It was on South Africa's Southern Cape shores that over 100,000 years ago, people first started drawing triangles and circles in the dance near Still Bay, indicating that early modern humans were capable of creating geometric patterns. This is one of the most profound artifact finds of our species, as we are the world's oldest engraved pieces of ochre, also found here, dating back 77,000 years, together with other finds such as deliberately perforated shells that were used to make necklaces. I'm sharing this because this is one of the earliest indications of human cognitive development. From this point, I now leap to where we are in the here and now. And I'm really excited about this conference because the right to research is all about human cognitive development. For me, this conference shares our collective aspiration to grow knowledge, to achieve knowledge without borders, and research without limits. It is all about collaborating worldwide with the aid of technology to solve humanity's problems, including climate change, health pandemics, food insecurity, and all the other grand challenges we are facing as expressed in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs as we popularly call them, Africa Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, And in South Africa here, we have the National Development Plan. And so do many African countries have a particular vision and a plan to achieve human potential and sustain our planet. So what does it mean to say that research is a right? Article 16, Section 1 in the South African Constitution's Bill of Rights states, everyone has a right to freedom of expression, which includes freedom of the press and other media, freedom to receive or impart information or ideas, freedom of artistic creativity, and academic freedom and freedom of scientific research. We know that the fundamental rights protect the right of everyone to benefit from culture and science, and we need research to fulfill these missions. We also know that both freedom of expression and participation in culture and science and technology are protected as rights in the Universal Declaration of Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Once we see research activities, both for the good and a right, then it bestows an obligation on government to invest in the field. And at the same time, it heightens burdens of justification when it acts in ways that deprive researchers of the ability to engage in their craft. This brings us to copyright law. As the name suggests, it is a regulation of what researchers can do with the materials of others. It regulates the making of a copy of another's work. Copyright is supposed to promote the moral and material interests of authors that human rights also protect. However, it often ends up protecting industry or governments, sometimes at the cost of authors. And if unrestrained by exceptions and limitations, then copyright can enable private censorship of public goods. Thus, human and constitutional rights are required that copyright laws be balanced, including to protect the rights of researchers, and I'm hoping the conference will be proactive about taking steps to strongly advocate for the removal of legal barriers to knowledge. Fair use and fair access needs to be applied across all forms of research and content we have today, from text to audiovisual to holograms and extended reality in the near future. Fair use in this era needs also to include the right to freely use technology and artificial intelligence as an aid in the pursuit of knowledge and research. An overriding degree of scholarship today is done using computational research, which creates unprecedented access to thousands of references relevant to research. Technology today helps us to read with computers, but when a computer reads, it makes a technical copy in the process. It reproduces the work being read and can thereby be seen to invoke outdated copyright laws. Is this digital mining of content for research purposes prohibited by copyright law? Is it needed for human rights? These are the key themes of this conference. The right to fair access to research requires a giant leap forward that could never have been imagined when copyright laws were imagined. Digitalization needs to be explicitly considered in negotiating or reforming copyright to ensure that the laws include essential research tools such as text and data mining. Recently in South Africa, there was an important judgment of the Constitutional Court which secured a provision in our Copyright Act, in our current Copyright Act, to convert books into braille or digital formats for screen readers. This was illegal before the case brought by Blind South Africa against the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition. Dr. Sanya Samtani was an academic advisor to Blind South Africa and Section 27 on the case. At the conference, we will be hearing Dr. Sanya Samtani, who is a leader on the application of human rights to copyright and who did her postdoctoral research in this area at the University of Pretoria. South Africa, like many other countries, is in the midst of a copyright reform process. One of the issues the reform seeks to address is the exceptions to copyright for public interest purposes like education and research. The question is, does this apply to anyone wanting to do research? What is the definition of a researcher? As Dr. Samtani explains, from a human rights perspective, it should include everyone without discrimination, because we have public libraries which exist to offer all people the right to education, knowledge, and research. We need to hurry up with our definitions and decisions on these issues, as time is not on our side, and outdated copyright laws are still being applied to the detriment of the right to research. In South Africa, for example, the Copyright Amendment Bill is still in Parliament after more than a decade. It's fairly progressive, such as giving museums and libraries the right to digitalize their archives without contravening copyright law. But until it becomes law, South Africa is still relying on the Copyright Act of 1978, which is an apartheid-era act that urgently needs to be amended to bring it in line with the Bill of Rights and the digital era in which we live. As academic institutions specializing in copyright and IP issues, and as leading policymakers from across Africa, it is essential for us to cooperate in ensuring and defending the right to research and identify and address barriers to conducting and accessing research. It requires solidarity between all African countries and between the Global South and the Global North. The latter is the lion's share of research at this stage, but all countries need to accept the responsibility to facilitate research and ensure that there is fairness in its accessibility to all. This includes ensuring that businesses, multinationals, and other parties do not hinder access in any way, such as making research unaffordable for many countries. There's also an obligation on states to ensure that they have the infrastructure, notably digital infrastructure and internet access, to facilitate research. If any state does not have the finance to do so, it has the responsibility to seek financial assistance from the international community, which in turn, it is hoped, will act in solidarity. Africa in general allows a lot of fair use, but there is room for improvement. Internationally, however, a lot of information continues to be subject to copyright restrictions, such as only allowing quotation or research comes at a great cost. This requires for us to explore where information justice and intellectual property intersect. We are delighted to have Professor Sean Flynn from the American University, Washington College of Law at the conference. He is the director of the program on information justice and intellectual property. He will be discussing how every copyright law today has a research exception of some kind, but many have not been updated over time. Many still only apply to a physical world when we're actually living in a rapidly advancing digital era. And with rapidly advancing digital technologies, many things are coming into being at a faster rate than we can make laws and policies. It requires reviewing what is fair use or fair viewing in today's digitalized world. It goes without saying that certain fundamentals remain, such as you cannot sell someone's else work on the market in whatever form. The author must receive the compensation. We naturally want to continue to protect the author's rights and earnings. But at the same time, we need systems and laws that serve the interests of research and the production of new knowledge and new ways of accessing and producing it, such as with the assistance of artificial intelligence. The work of Professor Vukosi Marivate from the University of Pretoria offers an excellent example of how digital tools are transforming the kind of research we can do. He's a data science and natural language processing researcher who is developing innovative tools to teach machines how to process African languages, including the translation of text into or from African languages, many of which have very little natural language processing research to date. In order to build automated translation models, he requires access to data and permission to use it. The translation is first done by human translators and then graduates to machine translation with a human translator checking it. Professor Marivate's work brings together artificial intelligence researchers, natural language processing researchers, the humanities, and computational and mathematical scientists. If copyright laws block the right to translate, it severely stifles this innovative transdisciplinary endeavor that is so important for development in Africa. At the University of Pretoria, we strongly support the open science imperative and are focusing on accelerating open research to make articles publishing in accredited local and international journals freely available to students and academics. In fact, later this year, well, in a few months, in March, which is Africa Month, in the week leading to Africa Day, which is May 25, we'll hold a conference called Open Science, Open Africa at the Future Africa Institute, which you are going to visit this year. And at the center of that conference, we'll be pursuing these endeavors. Many, such as South Africa in general is pretty good about this, as is the United States. Many countries in Europe, on the other hand, allow text and data mining of research, but you have to be associated with a scientific or cultural institution to have the right. And if you are not, the rights owner can opt out. Even journalists are excluded, whereas in South Africa and the United States, they are included. As tricky a field as fair use, access, and the right to research is, it has the potential to change educational history as it opens up knowledge and research more than ever before, creating access to scholarship for everyone in so many different modes. It creates a playing field where institutions worldwide can help each other to aid to the global research body in two-way flow and stimulate more research in the global south. In turn, the global south can take huge steps forward through access to research from around the world without being limited by a lack of finance or outdated and inequitable copyright restrictions. At the moment, a considerable amount of research is behind paywalls, and the digital shift to online journals and books has been huge for universities and their libraries. At the University of Pretoria, we have 11 highly functional libraries where only 10% of journals are still hard copies. The rest are all online, for which we purchase a license or lease agreements at great cost. As we know, previously, many of the journals we published were published by universities or research institutions, but increasingly, they are being published by large international publishers that make considerable profits. A pressing discussion is happening about this worldwide as universities spend millions buying subscriptions with no discount, even if our academics have contributed. Many universities simply cannot afford this. This model also is a very anomalous in many ways. The work or the knowledge is created by academics. Then, in essence, is taken by these multinational global corporations, which then sell it back to the people who produced it. Typically, this is not how things should work. But this is the global system that we operate in it now, which needs urgent reform. How does the right to research intersect with this system? Can licenses override rights if they lease us materials online instead of selling us hard copies? Do we lose our traditional rights to make research copies? Institutions of higher learning have a pivotal role to play in the copyright engagement process in terms of how we engage with publishers and work with governments to develop a full understanding and practice of open and equitable access. Ensuring research is open source is key for a number of reasons, including, for example, global health systems. COVID-19 was a terrifying eye-opener in this regard. The ongoing development of strong biosecurity systems in Africa ensures safe trade in plant and animal products and protects countries against the entry and spread of plant and animal pests and diseases, and sanitary and phytosanitary threats. Sharing this research and immediately responding to any threats that arise is essential. If you like, this is the critical to what ought to happen in the knowledge action nexus, translating insights into impact. The many modes of research and knowledge that should be accessible to everyone are so diverse and exciting to share. To offer another example, as a media scholar, last year I spoke at a book launch of the International Association for Media and Communication Research. One of the books was Indigenous African Popular Music, Volume 1, Prophets and Philosophers, edited by Abdou Salau and Israel Fadipe, which explores how African popular music has long been an underappreciated medium of communication and a form of scholarship. The editors, Professor Abdou Salau and Dr. Israel A. Fadipe, both from the Northwest University in South Africa, explain that it is through music that knowledge and information about crises facing people's lives is shared, such as corrupt leadership, food insecurity, substandard education, youth unemployment, and homelessness. These are some of the major challenges facing the continent. African popular music artists are champions of good governance, the voice of marginalized populations, and repositories of indigenous cultural traditions. Fela Kuti, famous Nigerian, was an ambassador of such traditions of music. In every faculty and field, there are many examples of groundbreaking research that Africa can share with the world and wants to do so openly to contribute to finding solutions to the multiple crises and disruptions our planet faces. We need to extend research access and collaboration and integration in a quadruple helix approach between knowledge institutions, corporate, civil society organizations, and government. And the only way we can do this is by addressing and implementing all the aspects that the speakers at this conference will raise to achieve the universal right to research. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was covered so many of the different topics and themes and important things. Such an incredible opening. Next, we have a video from Professor Carlos Correa. He is the Executive Director of South Center. Dr. Correa is a lawyer and economist and is a renowned expert in the field of IP, advising governments and international agencies around the world.
On behalf of the South Center, let me give you a very warm welcome to this dialogue. As you may know, the South Center, as an intergovernmental organization of developing countries, has worked over the years in the area of intellectual property, including copyright, with the perspective that intellectual property rights are not end in themselves, but the regime must be designed in a manner that supports development objectives. This session will address a very important issue for all developing countries, certainly also for African countries. And this is about the research exception in the context of copyright. As you know, still the contributions of the African countries as a whole to the global research and development is small. And one of the conditions to increase this contribution and to better serve the interests of the people in African countries is to increase the capacity to undertake research, and copyright may pose limitations to these efforts. Let me give you a few examples. For instance, the area of health. In order to provide the best health services to the populations, there is a need for researchers, doctors to have access and do research on the most updated bibliography. And in some cases, we know, in particular, some technologies in the digital context do prevent access to this information and to do the necessary research. If we consider education, it is not possible to have an education of good quality without research being undertaken by professors and other educators. which can reflect then the outcomes of research in the educational process. If there is a need to establish, as it is the case, an industry, to develop an industry, innovation is crucial, and then this also needs research. So this means that a broad research exception in the context of copyright is necessary to promote the development objectives in the African countries. And this can be done consistently with international law. This is the kind of discussion we are going to engage, and I hope that you have very productive debates on the matter. And this session is particularly timely for 3 reasons. In the first place, because several African countries are in the process of reviewing their copyright laws, and then this opportunity to look in particular at the subject. Secondly, because the African group has made an important submission to the committee, the Standing Committee on Copyright in the World Intellectual Property Organization, to put in place a program on limitations and exceptions in copyright, and we really need to support strongly the implementation of this program, and the debates that will take place in this session can also contribute to that process. And thirdly, because a protocol on intellectual property is being discussed in the context of the African Continental Trade-Free Area, and then these discussions may also provide some inputs for development of the protocol and help to include the right approach in relation to research exception. Let me thank our co-sponsors, in particular University of Pretoria, for the opportunity to organize this meeting in South Africa, an important member of the South Center, and I wish you a very productive discussion.
Okay. Thank you so much to Professor Correa and everybody from South Center. Next, I'm going to hand over to the chair for the first session, Ben Cashdan. Ben Cashdan is a filmmaker who's been making South Africa's biggest town hall debate show, The Big Debate. And he was also an advisor in Nelson Mandela's presidency. He was an economic advisor, and he's also at the forefront of copyright activism in South Africa. So, Ben Cashdan, everyone.
Kyla, 1, 2, yes. We are here. We are having the Right to Research conference in South Africa. It's been quite a journey. Forward to a global knowledge economy in which Africa plays an equal or leading part. Forward! Oh. It's not working. It's our call and response in South Africa. Let's try the second one. You're supposed to, if you agree with the sentiment, you're supposed to echo the first word or two. Long live the spirit of participatory policy making, where we have civil society, government, and all stakeholders together trying to work out a future that we share consensus on. Forward. Long live. What was the first word supposed to be there? Long live. My mistake. I have to admit, I've jumped around a bit. You heard it. From being a policy advisor in the Mandela presidency, filmmaker, activist. Some say I'm a little bit confused, haven't decided where to be when I grow up. They might be right. I say we have to have a leg, a foot in every camp in order to feel where we can have the most influence, exert the most pressure. Luckily, in this gathering, no single person has to be more than one thing, because we have that coming together of different sectors. We have dots that we can join in this conference that haven't been joined that many times before. We join the dot of public and civil society, government and civil society. And we join the dot, as Prof. Kupe said, joining the past to the future. We are 40 kilometers east of the cradle of humankind, the place where the largest ever collection of human ancestral remains was found, where the first evidence of the controlled use of fire was discovered by Homo erectus. Some of the first stone tools, along with Ethiopia to the north. So let's fast forward just a mere million years to today. What's the situation? Just extending on what Prof. Kupe said, we know that in the global copyright system now, in the global IP system now, from trademarks to copyright to patents, all forms of intellectual property, the royalties are a de facto tax on Africa. We are creators, we're inventors, we are putting into the knowledge economy, but there is a very dramatic undervaluing of what Africa puts into the global economy from a knowledge point of view, such that when you take the United States and you take Europe off the list of rankings and quantification of royalties on intellectual property, you're left with a few other mentions for Japan and one or two other countries, and Africa comes in a 10% at the bottom labeled all others. What that means is that every genuine conversation about intellectual property, and for this conference, copyright, on this continent is a conversation about redress, or as I believe Wikipedia calls it, the Wikimedia Foundation calls it, knowledge equity, or as some of us will call it, will continue to call it, those of us who don't have to be as polite as those in government, decolonization of the knowledge system from an African point of view. When we talk from Africa about exceptions and limitations, we are talking about redress. We are talking about Africans being able to access that which is accessible to many around the world who already have policies and laws in place for copyright exceptions for educational and other purposes. Exceptions which apparently they don't want African governments to have. Other governments have lobbied ours very strongly against the passing of the Copyright Amendment Bill in South Africa. That's one of the reasons why, as Prof. Kupe said, it's 10 years in the making and it has been nearly passed 5 times. When we talk about the right to research, we are of course talking about redress in Africa for all the reasons that Prof. Kupe said. When we talk about fair royalties for creators, for actors, for musicians, for authors, for artists, we are talking about redress. And of course, when we talk about traditional knowledge and valuing traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, we are talking about redress, about giving communities who've been custodians of that knowledge a foothold to determine how it's used and how it can benefit them. So although those different agendas sometimes seem like agendas which could be in opposition, I think from an African perspective, they're all part of the same agenda. Well, we have Recreate South Africa, which brings together all of those different stakeholders, from civil society to creators, organizations, educators, and so on. And we hope that those who are visiting from outside will mingle with all the other members of Recreate South Africa who are here, and we'll have exchanges with them. One of the most important stakeholders in Recreate South Africa is Blind South Africa, one of the most important affiliates who are here today right now. We are extremely grateful to PIGIP, the Program on Information Justice and Intellectual Property at American University, Wikimedia, the 2 universities, Pretoria and Cape Town, for allowing Recreate to be the hosts of this conference. It's quite unusual for civil society, not even the academics in the institution, to be the conveners of this gathering. So thank you very much to everyone who's coming for placing trust in us to do that. Now I want to call forward the most important people in this conference, who are the people doing the research for our first conversation. So if I can invite my panelists, I'm going to scoot along to the other side, Kathleen and Angeline and Vukosi who else? And Christo to join us for this conversation, and Abdou. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to stand here. Please take a seat here. 1, 2, 3. Oh no, there is one more seat. Yeah. But I'm going to start by standing here. So with these mics, you just need to push the first, thing on the left, and I think they queue up. If too many people have them all open at the same time, someone has to switch theirs off. So we decided to have the conference as a panel discussion. And I'm from the world of TV, so it's quite normal for the facilitator or chair to be facing and having a conversation like this. I'll come and sit down in a moment. But I want to start with Kathleen. And I'm going to introduce one by one the panelists as we start speaking. So Kathleen Siminyu is an AI researcher focused on natural language processing for African languages. She works as machine learning fellow at the Mozilla Foundation to support the development of a Kiswahili speech recognition dataset and to build transcription models for end-use cases in the agricultural and financial domains. She's currently part of an AU-constituted committee to develop an AI strategy for Africa. Kathleen, you're doing some exciting stuff in the context of the opening of the conference and the whole conference, looking at, amongst other things, as part of your Masakhane network, that wasn't mentioned in your bio, but you're one of the founders, together with Vukosi, of the Masakhane network, looking at the decolonization of science, bringing science to young people in their languages, the recognition of African names by computational processes that are dealing in names and searching and analyzing data. Why does it matter? Why are you doing it, if it needs saying? How are you using computer technology to do some of this stuff? And why is access to data an issue for you? Maybe you can tell us a little story, not wanting to ask you too many questions, but a little story about some of the problems and issues you've had in trying to use computational methods to further those goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Wait a second, just keep on speaking. It should be working.
Hi. Can you hear me? No. It's red though.
I think it's working, and it's working. Should we bring it slightly closer to you? Or you can hold the mic if you want, but it is working.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Ben, and thank you for having me here. I'll start by giving a brief introduction of Masakhane. So this is a network of researchers. It is Pan-African, so we have researchers from across the continent as well as global researchers who support our work in primarily building natural language resources for African languages. And why is this work important? Well, because we're in the digital age. We are increasingly moving more and more onto online platforms, and it's glaring that, the languages that are largely or primarily supported are, English and other Western languages. So what then happens is that we as Africans who our first or preferred languages may not be the Western languages are then second-class citizens on the internet and on digital platforms. And this then compounds. So it makes the digital divide grow. If we look at foundational digital resources like keyboards or online dictionaries, the fact that many of them don't exist for African languages makes it much harder for those of us who would like to create content in our languages to do that on computers. It's not as easy as, making a spelling mistake on, say, Google Docs and then having that quickly corrected. even when it comes to the recognition of our names, you know, the very clear red underline that tells you, hey, this word has been misspelled, would you like to change it to one of these suggestions, when the reality may be that that is your name. So the fact that first, we're not first-class citizens on the internet and these foundational resources don't exist means that the compounding effect of the digital divide keeps growing and growing. And finally, access to knowledge. Right? The internet has led us to this place where a lot of information is freely available online, but then the truth is that it's locked in Western languages. So our work also focuses on identifying what pieces of information should be accessible in African languages. And in this work, we of course prioritize African knowledge. In terms of the how, data is important. So I'll go back to part of the how Masakhane came to be. All the lights went out. I'll assume that's perfectly normal.
That's perfectly normal. That's the South African reality.
Okay.
Luckily, we are now burning a bit of diesel and keeping our lights and our Zoom call on, we hope. Please keep going.
Okay. Great for the environment. So Masakhane began with a focus on machine translation, and this is just the automatic translation of text from one language to another. The reason this particular task was an easy entry point is because of the existence of a data set, I should say previously known as the JW300. JW stands for Jehovah's Witness, and this is a religious organization that has done a lot of work in evangelizing in many places in the world and in Africa as well. So their data set was a very rich resource in availability or inclusion of African languages, and it made or fueled the effort, because with a notebook, and a notebook is just a compilation of code that you run. With a notebook, it was very easy for us to get individuals from across the continent to start creating or training machine translation models for their languages by simply getting the notebook and changing the ISO code or the relevant code for their language, right? So I'm Kenyan. I was very interested in making sure that Kenyan languages are included, and so I looked at the list of languages included in the data set and made sure to start training for as many Kenyan languages as I possibly could. And there are many other individuals like myself across the continent who started their efforts in this way. This work has been hugely successful. We have over 40 machine translation models trained. Many of them are the first of their languages. And this work has also been recognized widely in research circles. So it's been accepted at leading NLP conferences and has received a research award from the Wikimedia Foundation, actually. So it's great to see those representations here. But then when we started digging into the origins of this JW300 dataset, I should mention that we began as a community of individuals who were just doing this work, and we have sort of grown up over the years, have a registered entity, and that came with starting to get legal advice on how the correct way to do things is or should be. And so we started to realize that, hey, we should investigate the origins of this JW300 dataset and realize that actually it is created from copyrighted material that we did not have permission to use. The creators of the dataset had also not received permission, explicit permission to use the dataset, but then they had asked for permission and received no response. And I think in then starting to seek permission for this dataset, well, the JW folks were very hard to access, but then when they did find out that this dataset had been curated from material that they had created without their permission, they requested that it be taken down. And eventually it was taken down. We have tried to seek their permission to use the data since, but this has not been successful. Then moving on to Masakhane, we have grown out of machine translation, which was the initial push. We now have researchers who are interested in very many varied fields. So we do have work in speech recognition, we have work in named entity recognition, and the beautiful aspect of the community is the fact that you as an individual can come with your research interest and have a community that could support you to make your work multilingual or to scale it in some way if this is your interest. I'll perhaps conclude by saying that access to data is still a very difficult thing or task. We often have to apply for grants to create data, which puts us at a great disadvantage because NLP researchers from other places in the world can, potentially wake up and say, hey, this is my research interest, and have access to a data set and just focus on the research. But we often have to look for the funding, create teams, bring people together, and then start creating the data set before we can actually get to doing the actual research that we would like to do. So having access to data that already exists would be of great value. But then very, very many data owners at this time in the world, when you mention AI and use of their data, want to be paid, which brings us to this conundrum where we're trying to do research, but then they believe that there's commercial value in the work that we're doing. And in a perfect world there is, but we are not able to pay for the data at this point. I shall conclude at this point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. So we are putting an issue on the agenda of the next session, please, Sean Flynn, which is whether or not there is a solution to the access of the JW300. And I believe that SIPIT has been doing some work on this, so we'll hear a bit more from SIPIT. But in the sort of context of global copyright reform, models for exceptions and limitations, what, if anything, would restore the ability of Masakhane to use the JW300 dataset for training its translation tools? I'd never thought before about, African names and the fact that your name isn't recognized and the keyboard doesn't work for you. You can't even write your name. I have a French keyboard from time at WIPO, and it's bad enough trying to find the letters on that keyboard. I think that's, internationally traveling white people's problems. Let's move on and talk to Vukosi, Prof. Vukosi Marivate, who is the ABSA University of Pretoria Chair of Data Science and Associate Professor of Computer Science. He works on developing machine learning, artificial intelligence methods to extract insights from data and on the intersection of machine learning and natural language processing. He's a chief investigator in a number of the Masakhane NLP projects. Now, Vukosi, we've been talking over the last few weeks and months about some of the case studies, and that's what I'm interested in and I think many people here would be very keen to hear, what data have you been trying to sort of get your hands on, get your teeth into, and prise open for the purposes of sharing it, making it available, engaging with audiences in South Africa and Southern Africa who don't always have access? And I know you've been working on a couple of examples where the data you're trying to access or translate or train on is information that many of us take for granted from the government, from journalistic sources. So you would think maybe that institutions like the SABC, I don't know if we have the former board member who registered for this conference, Mike Markovitz, there you are. All right, so we'll engage you in this conversation, sir, and Isaac Minar. How did the SABC respond? That's one question going straight into your case study. When you said, I have a computer that can translate all of your journalistic work into many languages that you don't reach out in, and many more questions like that. Over to you, Vukosi.
Okay, it's great to be here and actually see everybody. It has been like one of those journeys to get here, and I think not for myself, but for many people in the room, this is just a milestone in moving forward. So here at the University of Pretoria, I run the Data Science for Social Impact Research Group, and 70% of the work, it used to be less, has now shifted mostly to working in language. So even when I'm here, we have interns, other students who are literally in the lab or online working within these areas. So if I jump maybe directly into thinking about language, one of the areas I'm very interested in is in the news area, right? So we can take a step back and let's not worry about translation so far, but then can we have news content that's available in our languages, and then can we start processing it for different things? So one of the things that you might want to do that seems very simple is just having metadata that just tells you, here's a news story, this news story is connected with this topic, right? So it has to do with sports, it has to do with business, all those things. Carrying on from Kathleen, we take it for granted that if you use other news aggregation tools, you can just choose these things and then they show up in, like, in English and German. But then we don't have that in our languages. And one part is, okay, is there even content in that language? So if you go to, you have a national broadcaster like the SABC in South Africa, they've got radio in all the languages. They're about to launch, I think, a 24-hour news channel now that touches all of these languages, but you have like the SABC news portal written in English. So one of the things that we had to do as part of a Masakhane project to do named entity recognition, so identifying if there's a name of a person and of an object in a sentence, was could we take could we use some of the sabcnews.com content and then from there translate it into one of the other languages in South Africa and then do the entity tagging that we can then use to train machine learning algorithms or AI algorithms. And that's still a conversation that's going on. The project is kind of done, but we didn't get to a point where we have an agreement about these things. We were not saying in the part of the national broadcaster would have to carry a cost of doing this. It's not, it's the content is there. We just want to use it for research purposes. And this also might allow, we make the translations available back because then allow some of the content to be available in actually more languages than just English on the sabcnews.com kind of website. Moving from maybe that example was, my mother is actually Tawana. So one of the things I was working on early on was Tawana. And if you want to get news in Tawana, you have to go to the Botswana government. They have a website called the Daily News, and it has some of their content. Most of the content is in English, but some of their content has a tag written in Tawana. You can go there and actually read in Setswana. And then we thought this would be great. Now we have a content that's in Setswana. While we're waiting for other things to resolve, we can use this, do the tagging, and then be able to build on top of it. Started trying to emails bounce back, so they're not even updated on the website. That's one. Starting to use Facebook Messenger, doing private messages to the people there saying, hey, we would like to use this for research. We just want to check, are we okay? Interacting with the university legal here, going we've been now 18 months into this process. We're not getting any responses. What do we do, right? And the biggest thing on our side is we would like to re-release parts of this with the tags on them so that people can actually use them, right, for research purposes. And we're stuck in this situation. Finally, get a message back on Facebook. So emails weren't working. Even the ones that I found, were they would just go in, and it was, oh, we'll get back to you, right? And this was now 2019. We'll get back to you, don't worry. Then 2020, I checked again. We'll get back to you. Now we're in 2023. I've never gotten any things. And with the advent of what happened with JW300, we became you become very concerned about the uncertainty that this places towards research within there, just because now you don't have a clear, especially even a single market where you even know across the continent, not just South Africa, how do we handle kind of such situations? Yeah, so those are just two examples. With the SABC, we would love to work. We would love to do any with the Botswana government. We will release, especially the tags and all those things, for people to be able to do that. Because the other thing that is a concern from almost maybe archival is that if we don't do this as well, we keep on thinking that the internet kind of exists forever. Those things disappear. So right now we might be concerned, I'm thinking, with all of these, the copyright and everything like that. And then 25 years from now, it's all deleted. And then it's it never was there before. And we even lose more, because language is not just these symbols, but there's a way of writing, a way of actually representing people within those languages that is very different to just, it was translated. I was going to say with the Botswana one, I like it sometimes because it's written in that way. It's not just a translation of the English news. In a way, it was written for a community to say, what that community was doing.
It's really interesting, Vukosi. I mean, anyone who hasn't shaken Vukosi's hand and had a conversation with him yet, grab him before the end of the conference, because he's got about 20 more stories like those two. But I've never thought about that, you know, as directly before. You lose history if you are not translating or not interfacing in different languages at the time. There then is no record of what was happening and what people were saying. Again, for the lawyers in the next session, we know about orphan works. Those of us who are lay people, we know about orphan works where there is no copyright ownership and it's clear that there is, or you cannot contact the original owner. What about where the Botswana government doesn't return its emails or its calls for 5 years? Does that mean that the work is effectively then an orphan work? Sorry if these are simple or obvious questions, but just filtering through to the next session for the lawyers. I'm going to mention by name again Michael Markowitz and Isak Minar, both formerly at the SABC. If either of you would like to say something now or later, you know, we'd be thrilled to hear from you on why it might be that the SABC didn't respond, even when you folks, because you are great folks, were there, why it wouldn't be easy necessarily for somebody like Vukosi to say to the SABC, give me all your content, I'm only going to do good things with it. And he doesn't necessarily get a good reception. Good things being making it more accessible, you know, to large audiences. So feel free to indicate if you'd like to say something now or later. Or you'll confer first. Did you want to say something right now? Later, okay, great. Let's move on and speak to Angeline Waregi, who is a research manager and senior research fellow at the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law, CIPIT, in Kenya. She's an experienced research scientist with a decade of experience in project management, experimental design, grant acquisition training and outreach program development, and training of early career researchers. Now, I want to point out that Angeline has been very involved in an interaction with another institution at Strathmore University in Nairobi called iLab Africa, who are doing a lot of work on climate change research, including computational methods being applied to climate change research. Neither John or Betsy from iLab Africa made it to South Africa, partly due to passport and visa problems, we believe. And so Angeline has very kindly agreed to represent not only her institution, but the one she works with at iLab Africa, or at least to reflect a little bit on their work. And I think what we want to know about that work, and feel free to let us know if you need to refer questions, you know, in more detail for later answering by your colleagues. But I think what we're interested in is, why does that work matter? What is the kind of work that Strathmore is involved in around climate change and the application of computational research methods using data and scholarship in Kenya and in the continent on climate change? And what are the problems, broadly speaking, that are encountered when you're trying to scan through, assess, make sense of trends in climate, weather, soil, all those important things on the African continent? Over to you, Angeline.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So why is AI climate change research important? For a variety of reasons. I think I'll just mention three to start off with. So the first is agriculture. So I don't think it's controversial to say agriculture is the backbone of Africa. I mean, that's a gross generalization, but I think that holds true. And a lot of what we see in terms of agriculture here on the continent is significantly different from what we see in Europe or the US. So we have a lot of smallholder farming, right? And the success of your farming activities is really tied into weather patterns, into the soil, into how your land behaves in general. And that is all going to be affected by climate change. Second, the urban rural migration. I think that is happening in most countries in Africa, we have people living rural areas, moving to the urban centers for a variety of reasons. But I think the thing that's important is that that migration will affect climate in one factor or another, and it is affected by climate. So a lot of areas that are arable are drying up. People need jobs, need ways to generate income. So you see people moving to the urban centers. So that's another reason we need to understand how climate change will happen and evolve on the continent. And the third is tourism. So I'm from Kenya, we're in South Africa. A big part of our national revenue comes from tourism. So what if in 30, 50 years, you want to go to Masai Mara, or you want to go to Kruger National Park, and it's a swampland or it's desert, like, you'll have migration of animals happening that will affect the national GDP. So all those and a lot more are affected by climate change. And what AI research does, it allows us to be able to predict what that is likely to look like. We can run computational models, simulations, and look at possible evolutions of the environment, of weather patterns, and all that. For us to be able to do that, all that is predicated on access to data, right? So weather data is factual information, and that's not covered by copyright laws. But once we have someone look at that data, pick certain parts of it, compile it, reanalyze it, then we get into territories where there's value added and copyright could attach to that. Or maybe that data is now stored in a platform where copyright is comes into play and we don't have access to it. So that really affects what we're able to have access to in terms of our research. Also, a lot of research in general is really stepping on shoulders of those who came before us, and that's all information that we get from publications in journals, but that work is sometimes behind a paywall, and if we cannot access prior publications on AI research in Kenya or AI research in Tanzania or in the East African or West African region, right? So we don't really understand what is happening currently or in the past in terms of AI research. It also makes the studies that we do a little bit less transparent, less reproducible. So those are all areas that we need to think about. So in a nutshell, climate change affects everyone and everything on the continent. That's why it's important. And we need access to the widest, broadest, most granular type of data available. And sometimes for us African researchers, it's better, instead of having raw weather data or raw data, it's better if it's reanalyzed and packaged in formats that are a little bit better for the type of research that we're trying to do.
Thank you so much, Angeline. I didn't need to give any of those disclaimers at the beginning for you representing your colleagues. I hope Prof. Malabakeng Forere and Sean Flynn will be open to us passing more issues. I think that's the idea of this conference. I'll stop apologizing for doing so. We want to know, I think, so just to clarify, the raw data is accessible when you're doing climate change work. There's government data which is accessible. What happens is that people do something with that data. They say, we've added value, it's now become our database. This is now a specialized database because of some things that we've added to it. Presumably nobody quite knows what has been added, or there may be some lack of transparency over exactly what's been added, and then it's behind a paywall and you can't access it.
In a nutshell, yes. So a lot of the raw data is available through government organizations or even NGOs like UNEP or UNESCO. It's all out there. But sometimes what you need is, drought patterns in Wajir in northern Kenya. So maybe someone has taken that raw data and packaged it into that type of that specific thing that you're looking for, and that is what is under the paywall or behind the paywall, sorry.
And that's issue number one. And issue number two was just generally access to scholarship on climate change, so you can, trawl through and see what other people have come across and do comparative research. Go ahead.
Oh, no, yes. I'm just going to say yes.
So We're passing you 2 issues, lawyers in the next session. And I want to sharpen the first one, because it is a little bit of a difficult one to find our way into, particularly as, you know, those of us who are either researchers or activists or creators and not the lawyers. Is there a provision in a right to research context, an exception or limitation to copyright or something beyond that, which can crack open a database that is behind a paywall? Can you get access using copyright exceptions or limitations? If you have some access, if you have one login, but the license says you're allowed to look through individual items, you're not allowed to scan the entire database, compare it with other databases, you know, you have limited access or access for one purpose. Hopefully in the next session we'll get a little bit of a sense, and anyone on this panel is welcome to comment on it, of what can be done to open things up. And I think as we come to the next round of the conversation, that's where we're going to head. Is we've got 2 more speakers, but I'm just giving an advance warning that what I think we're going to come to is questions around what solutions as researchers are you searching for to the problems that you've encountered? Is it about more negotiating power with your interlocutors, whether it's the Jehovah's Witnesses, whether it's the Botswana government and the SABC, whether it's private providers of climate change data? Are you looking for an ability to negotiate more forcefully? Or are you looking for legal recourse? And if you're looking for legal recourse, based on the interactions you've already had with legal advisors at SIPIT and other places, and Christo is going to talk shortly, and I know his legal advisors sit within Section 27, and as has been mentioned previously, Sanya Samtani. What kind of legal recourse does it occur to you that you might need in order to open up your right to use computational methods and research? Now, let's come on to Abdou. We want to come along to Dr. Abdou Beukeu, who is a scientific information and bibliometric specialist in Senegal. An advance warning, if you're listening, this is where we'd like interpretation from the interpretation booth, please. And for everybody on the floor, you should have a headset. Abdou is going to speak in French, and we pray that you'll be able to hear him speaking in English. Just now, when the power went off, we maintained everything here, but the University of Pretoria, about half their systems did go down. They've now recovered, so hopefully everything will work. And the question for Dr. Sow is about your research that you are doing in Senegal. And I want to let slip a little confidence that you told me, but you've given me your permission to let it slip, which is vous utilisez l'accès pour recherche qu'on vous a donné de l'Université de Lille en France.
Oui.
So Professor Abdou Sow is using his login to some of the scientific and research databases that he has from his time at the University of Lille in France, and not logins available at local institutions in Senegal. Have you got French? When I spoke briefly in French there, let's give it a try. Great. So over to you, Prof.
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for giving me the floor. I come from a long way. I come from Senegal, but after listening all the presentations and discussions, I'm quite happy to be here. Now, I'm using a login from Lille University. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Now, I'm using access or login from the University of Lille in order to connect and to have information on Senegal, because I'm working on evaluation of research. Now, what you need to do is that in Senegal, like in most of the African countries, we do not have competence, because we have spoken about literacy, information literacy, and today we can say that all the capacities to use information, we need to manage data. And in Africa, we do not understand the data, we don't know how to treat it, and we don't know how to have access to data. Now, I'm currently doing a research in epistemology. So to know how to teach and how to make people understand, or how the researchers can it's quite important. So I think it's also important for other companies like the Moscovic. We have a battle that comes with a presentation. Now, the way that we access to things will make us, or the conception, the way we conceive data will help us, or will have an impact on our behavior to use those the data that we have done. First of all, I'm working on the access to the transformation of that conception that people have. Firstly, for young people or young researchers. Now, when you talk about text mining, we call it free the text, data mining and text mining. I have done a lot of research in that. Before to talk about my research, I would like to talk about governance of data, because when you talk about governance of data, it's the processes, norms, and parameters that will help that information be used in an effective way, so to help all organizations in order to achieve the objectives. So it means that today it is indispensable that we should, master data. Now, all the principal actors are governments and researchers. And you know that in 1973, I'm not sure if you understand the McBride report that spoke where African countries came together and asked the World Organization concerning information. And now that World Information Organization, we are now, oftentimes we try to evaluate in a competition that we think there's no equity. When we are going to evaluate research, what do we use as corpus? That is that we look at the African research, and we look at the database of Scopus database, African database, where we are not well represented. So when we look at universities in Africa, we always at the bottom of the list. And when you look at evaluation of research, we have the Madagascar Council that try to, in a way that countries in Africa should have a database that will allow them to evaluate or assess this data in effective way. So I believe that we are still under the control of those who are out there in the world. And we know that we as Africans, we do not have access to data in a correct way. And as African researchers, we want to use those information, and they have access to our data, but we do not have access to their data, and we want to have access to their data. We have to pay for it, and we are obligated to go in the data of Scopus data or the data science data in order to do our research. Now, I'm currently working on the mapping of research using the data of Scopus, and to have access to that, I cannot go through my university. I have to go through the University of Lille in France. That allows me to export data and also to be able to do analysis and that what we call the mapping, research mapping. And that mapping allows me to understand how the research goes on in our institutions or in our universities, but as well as in in other universities of the commercial space. There's something else that has been developed beside the data corpus, which is quite expensive, and we do not have access to that database, and that will allow us to see how the links or nexus that exist between different institutions, and it's nothing else because the database is quite expensive, but these are data from Scopus which has been mapped. So if we have access to that, we can do our work ourselves. So we don't have to buy and understand how our research is organized. So I can assure you, like that, in our institutions we're working hard, working enough, so that I'm sure that in less time we'll be able to access information, and definitely the problem will be solved. But we need to make enough efforts, because we cannot analyze based on nothing, because for now we cannot bring all the scientific data in our data. For the first objective that we have, but is that we do that, but we cannot do that if we don't have the support of policymakers. And I think that this type of conferences and this type of engagement will help us to have strategies so that policymakers could be aware of what we are doing, and then decide and to take good decisions. Thank you so very much.
Good. Well, we have some policymakers here.
J'espère que la traduction a été fidèle.
I'm waiting for the translation. What did you say? Yeah, I think it was. We have some policymakers here, and I'm not going to put anybody in the spot, seems to be my trademark in this session, but perhaps in the last session today, policymakers from West Africa, where you are from, and other parts of the continent, you can let us know, if you are able, whether you have something up your sleeve in terms of national legislation that you're working on, or work within WIPO, to assist somebody like Abdou, who wants to do work in a database of scholarly articles. I think two of the areas you mentioned that you're working in are assessing universities, the ranking of universities, using quantifications of their scholarly output, and then also relations between published articles from different universities. And it's quite ironic, I think, that, sitting in Africa wanting to, assess and make comments on the quality and quantity of academic production in universities, you can't access the data which is held somewhere outside of the continent in order to do that. So even just to comment on your own universities, in your country, in your continent, you need some data that is on another continent. And I wanted to clarify one thing: the absence of a login, the fact that there's no login that you could use at your university in Senegal, that's purely a cost issue. It's not purchased by the university. And that's why you're having to use the other one that is luckily accessible to you. That's that. So, exactly that. So the question would be, is there a global exception or limitation? Is there a global provision? Are there policies that would crack open platforms, and I keep using that phrase, if you're already in something like, what is it called? Scopus is the one that you're using from another institution. Can you? Prof. Dr. Abdou is doing it already. Dr. Sau is doing it already, taking a login from another university, making use of it in his context in Africa, and is happily, freely talking about it. It's not a hijacked login. It's a login that he legitimately has, but. Is that a process we should be extending? Is it, we've talked in some of these conversations previously about sharing of access, asking colleagues in other academic institutions, give me your access, then I'm going to go ahead and use them in my academic institution. What if there are licensing conditions when you log into a platform like Scopus that says it's only available, only to be used for specific purposes in your one academic institution? Could there be provisions of national law? Could there be global provisions that override those licensing conditions that you might have to sign up to get access? I want to ask you, in that vein, are you aware of whether or not there are conditions? Did you try to look into whether or not when you sign up to Scopus, because that seems to be the main source of data you're trying to use, whether there are limitations on what you're supposed to be able to do, and whether you've had to find a way to break through those limitations or not? Thank you.
Yes, truly, there are limitations, of course, because when you use login from University of Lille, I have access to the database, and then it helped me to export data and to follow up or to do analysis. But if I am connected, because you can have access to Scopus without, like we have other friends of mine that have access, but they do not have subscription. And when you don't have subscription, you cannot have access to all data. And oftentimes they ask them to show that publications that I'm making are included in Scopus magazines, and sometimes they cannot, they don't have access to that, and it's a problem. So for me, it's absurd. I think that these agencies or these scientific should have discussions to allow African countries, African researchers to have access to this data. But as I said earlier, as Africans, we are trying to make our best. We have put in place a database of revision of data, but we only started now. But if this project could go to the end, I think we'll be able to solve some issues and problems. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I said that we were not the lawyers, and the lawyers would be in the next session, but our next speaker is most definitely a lawyer, an advocate at the High Court in South Africa, and Vice President of Blind South Africa, serving on its executive committee. Christo de Klerk, to my left, has also served on the national executive of the South African National Council for the Blind. Currently, he's a former EXCO member of the South African Braille Authority, which is the standard-setting body for Braille in South Africa. And he's also on the EXCO of the International Council on English Braille. Now, Prof. Kupe, in his introduction, referred to a landmark Constitutional Court judgment that took place earlier this year that declared sections of the existing Copyright in South Africa, Copyright Act in South Africa, the Copyright Act of 1978, if I'm not mistaken, unconstitutional on the basis of discrimination, and granted relief to Blind South Africa to have sections of the long-awaited Copyright Amendment Bill read into law. And one of the people directly behind that litigation, which was successful and led to the Constitutional Court judgment, was Christo de Klerk. And I want to ask you two things, Christo. What do you think is the significance of that judgment? What does it do for you? And where can one take it from here, both for visually impaired people, and do you think it sets a precedent for the broader community in South Africa and beyond to declare illegal a Copyright Act that fails to have adequate exceptions and limitations for the needs, the educational needs of the whole population? Because visually impaired South Africans are discriminated against, but of course so are learners in schools who don't have access to educational materials. And then can you say a word or two about the technology that you're exploring along similar lines to the other speakers on the panel to now take advantage of that judgment? You've mentioned to us prior to the conference that you're looking at some text-to-speech technology for visually impaired people that wouldn't previously have been accessible without that judgment. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Just now, when the lights failed, I thought at last we've now leveled the playing field. Those lights are no use to me, so they're no use to anyone else. When I was a student, now relax, I didn't do it here, I studied at Stellenbosch. I was studying law, but in order to get my law degree and to become a lawyer, I had to break the law. I had to get people to take books from the library, read them, make recordings of them for me, and that was against the law. So for the 5 years of my BA and LLB degrees, I did that. So one can say I became an habitual criminal to become a lawyer. Now, that sort of nonsense stopped on the 21st of September last year when the Apex Court found that the Copyright Act of 1978 was unconstitutional, and the court dictated text to be read into it to give us the copyright exemptions so that we no longer have to grovel before publishers for permission to make material accessible. And only 10% of our requests were ever granted. And it could take a very long time. So I think when you see blind people on the street, you can know that they are criminals. We had little choice. Now, the Apex Court removed one obstacle in alleviating our book famine, because only 0.5% of material is accessible to blind persons. Now, a world of books has opened, but we still need to be able to access them. They can be accessed in various ways. They can be converted into Braille. They could be read personally. They could be read by humans and recorded, or we could use text-to-speech. I'm doing a presentation about that tomorrow, so I'm not going to say too much about it, but text-to-speech is computer software which enables a computer to generate speech in a specific language. Blind people then use screen reading software which use text-to-speech engines to generate the speech in the language that is required. We have a problem in South Africa that of our 11 official languages, there's only feasible or usable text-to-speech in English. There are attempts, have been attempts to make text-to-speech in our other languages, but really they are not seriously usable. And I will show some examples of that tomorrow. The Blind SA is currently in the process of negotiating with developers to create text-to-speech in some of our languages. It is a big and a costly project, but it is necessary. The effect of the judgment of last year was that we can now make books accessible, but we still have an issue of making them accessible in many of our languages because we do not have TTS in those languages. Still, we've had serious problems, as I illustrated earlier, with students not having their material. That has now come to an end thanks to the judgment. But to obtain that judgment, Blind SA had to take the president to court twice. The first time was when he was sitting on the Copyright Amendment Act for over a year, for 13 months. So Blind SA took him to court to just get up and do something. He had a choice of doing one of two things. He could either sign the bill into law, or he could send it back to Parliament, which was what he did, but at least then he did something. But they say the president sits on everything, he even sits on his money in his couch. Anyway, so we have that victory, but the fight is not completely won yet. We still need government to accede to the Marrakesh Treaty, because there are still some publishers who restrict international exchange of books to countries which have acceded to the Marrakesh Treaty. So that is going to be our next bit of advocacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Christo. The word is that he doesn't sit on absolutely everything. When he was chairman of MTN, and this is not speculation, it's well documented, he managed to get large quantities of money out of the country to Mauritius, where taxes are lower for that corporation. But look, you know, I don't throw that out idly. Our policymakers, from the president to every policymaker in government, are subject to influence from different quarters. And we know that the governments of the United States, through the US Trade Representative, and the European Union, representing so many influential governments, both wrote to the South African government raising concerns about the potential passing of the Copyright Amendment Bill into law. And we've got another session to talk more about that. But had you not brought that litigation, it is certain that we wouldn't have any of the Copyright Amendment Bill in law right now. And, you know, I'd love to hear your reflections on whether you think there is scope, if you've thought about this, for more litigation, you know, with an expanded class of litigants, because it's certainly something we're beginning to talk about in the broader movement, because, you know, we hear now that the National Council of Provinces in South Africa is looking at the legislation, you know, putting it through its final rounds of hearings, but we've heard it all before. We've been hearing this for years and years and years. So briefly, feel free to comment on that. And I did pass a microphone now up to Mike, former board member at the SABC, because I'd love to pose a question to you after Christo comes in if he wishes to.
I definitely think it is likely that there is more scope for litigation. You know, only one aspect of the Copyright Act of 1978 was tested in court, and that was found to be unconstitutional. So I think it is quite likely that there might be plenty more in it that is unconstitutional.
Thanks. And I mean, you know, maybe we should be having conversations, Vukosi and others. I don't know whether you have an appetite to be in court in the future to open, you know, the doors. But let's throw this issue to Mike Markowitz. Knowing you personally, Mike, I'm sure you wouldn't mind to engage in this conversation. We're not putting you on. You've got a mic in your hand. I passed you a mic because I don't think the desk mics at the back are working properly. It should be on if you just speak into it. It's the blue mic. Is it not on? Otherwise, Jason, if you wouldn't mind running with a...
Testing.
There we go. Great. So can I pose you a question, which is this. Vukosi approached the SABC and didn't get a good reception when it came to, didn't get an easy ride. In fact, was referred to lawyers who put his lawyers through their paces. When it came to, and Vukosi, correct me if I'm wrong, accessing journalistic material that he wanted to make more widely accessible using automated translation tools, amongst other things. Now, one of the questions would be, is there a cultural thing? It's a large organization. There are policies in place around accessing data, who to make them available to, and so on. Do you think there's a culture of what is sometimes called sort of hugging your data, holding it close to you, not trusting that people have good intentions or non-profit or beneficial intentions? Or is it a legal issue? Because I think they made recourse, the people that Vukosi spoke to at the SABC, to copyright as the reason why he couldn't do more and couldn't do it fast. Over to you, Mike.
Well, thanks for that ambush. Firstly, let me just say, obviously, I don't speak on behalf of the SABC. And as a former board member, I must say, when the issue was first raised, Vukosi appealed to me directly. And because it's an operational issue, it's strictly not normally an issue where a board member would get involved. So I just familiarized myself with the details, spent some time talking to him about it, trying to understand what the problem was, but obviously could not make a direct intervention myself. So let me just make that clear. Secondly, you raised, what is the problem? And you listed a whole bunch of potential factors. And I could be tempted to say all of the above. But one thing I need to just make clear, which I don't think a lot of people realize, the SABC is one of the most commercially dependent public broadcasters on the planet. It is currently 80% dependent on commercial revenue. It only gets 3% of its revenue from the state, okay? And in a situation like that with a massive public mandate and very little state support, what could be happening is pressure on people who are sitting in that institution when they're approached by someone with very genuine intentions like Vukosi, start thinking, well, hang on a second, am I passing up the opportunity of potential revenue for the SABC down the line? Am I going to get into trouble if I just give a blank check? So that's the first thing. And one can understand in a revenue constrained environment that they would be doing their job to see whether there is potential revenue for the SABC down the line. The second thing was, excuse me, on the legal side. And I'm not a copyright lawyer, and I wouldn't express an opinion, but they were relying on the Copyright Act, on a section which escapes me now, which was very debatable, I would say, in my own personal opinion, as to whether it indeed protected the commercial right of the SABC. Unfortunately, I don't think it made much progress after that, but I think what might be helpful, maybe not in this particular session, for Vukosi to set out exactly what that problem was and how they attempted to rely on a particular section, just so people can understand whether it's valid or not. Because it's one thing to say, the SABC was approached and they were being difficult and we didn't get anywhere. And it's another thing to understand is get into the weeds. What was the problem? Was it valid? How do you solve it in the future? And lastly, also to understand the situation of management, whether it's middle management, of pressure on them to generate revenue from whatever source, from whatever content, which bumps up against the right to research.
Thanks, Mike. And I want to pass over to Vukosi, but I want to throw in one more anecdote. I'm a filmmaker, so I have the right to throw in an anecdote here. And this is absolutely not directed at you, Mike. For 10, 15 years, I and many of my colleagues were making documentaries on various aspects of South African history. I'm not asking for a rejoinder here. I'm just telling a story, which is that we wanted to access footage for our documentaries, historical footage from the SABC. And one area that lots of filmmakers, and we often were charged, rates which were comparable with international rates. It was difficult to access the footage because we didn't have the budgets to access them. But when it comes to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the SABC was the only organization, as the public broadcaster, who had this treasure trove of recorded information of all the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission starting in 1996. And myself and many other filmmakers and many other institutions, South African History Archive and other institutions, tried to access that footage and were told it's not available unless there's a commercial basis for accessing it. We could have a commercial money-making project, but just free access is not possible, is what we were told. And eventually we got a government intervention and there was some limited access. But it didn't appear to us at the time as if the information was being used for any other good purposes. It wasn't, competing interests. It was sitting, rotting away in the SABC. And I feel qualified to tell this anecdote because I was very involved in efforts to liberate it. I want to reflect on fair use. Those of us who are arguing for fair use love it because it responds to the context and it has this notion of transformation. You said officials may be looking for money-making opportunities. Fair use is generally understood to put forward the idea, and this is the principle in the new Copyright Amendment Bill, if I'm not mistaken, that if you are transforming what was originally created, then the original creator should not really be saying, no, wait a minute, you can't use it because I might have wanted. I might at some stage have wanted to make money out of that new use that you've just come up with. Fair use would generally say, okay, you're transforming this thing. You're not using it within the confines of the original revenue generating model, and therefore it is fair to take it. And I think fair use would work for Vukosi in 2023 or 24 if it makes it onto the statute book. I think, and the lawyers must comment in the next session, that he would no longer even have to come to the SABC to use SABC data for the purposes that he's trying to use it. Vukosi, over to you. Do you want to share a little bit more about the journey you went on and what you think the legal recourses might be? Are you excited about fair use? Do you want to join a lawsuit with myself and Christo and others in the future?
Yeah, I guess again, those disclaimers. I'm not the university lawyer in this case, and I think through this journey, it's been very interesting. On one part of just learning how we sometimes, yes, we can all see things in different ways. It looks like the same thing, but then we don't experience it in the same way. To my best understanding, towards the conversation is still going on. As I said, it's not. I'm not giving up. It's been, 5 years of going down this road. Why give up now? We need to resolve this for researchers across the country. My understanding in terms of the last piece is what happens if now we use the copyrighted material, we remix it, we transform it. Should SABC now have, that becomes SABC IP afterwards. And that's where I think that's been the place where we're stuck at the moment, because it's like, no, but you're not putting in anything. We're saying, don't worry about it, we'll take care. We're not putting a cost to the SABC, but we are doing something that can enhance it and also make it accessible to more people. And also what happens is, if the thing that is transformed, there's this quest of, well, people should keep on going back to the SABC to ask for permission for the transformation as well. And we're trying to say, no, that shouldn't be the case at all, because you're not involved in the transformation. And we're not saying you shouldn't be involved. We've given many, many different options in this case. And it's something that, and fair use becomes interesting in that perspective, but there is still this feeling of mine, maybe naive, of the SABC has to go on this journey. We can't leave them and say, well, we're going to just go around it, because I think there's more that's sitting on there. The story I put up on there is that there's work by Ponzo Pilani on Motsweding FM in 2020, where while COVID was going on, she was giving these updates for COVID for people who were Setswana speaking. It's put up right now, it's just as audio for these podcasts. We don't really have transcripts, we don't have all these other things, but it's such a rich piece of information about how do you speak about health in Setswana, right? And there could be so many different ways that this could actually be helpful later on if we use machine learning, we bring in linguists, and then we start actually creating tools that could assist people in talking about health in something like Setswana or Sepedi and Sesotho. But right now, without really getting into these conversations, it might sit there on their podcasting third party that they're using, and it might again in 15 years be deleted, and that's it. And there's nothing.
So we're getting towards the end of the session. I'm watching the time. We started this session about 25 minutes late. I think we're going to end it 10 minutes to 15 minutes late. We'll gain a little bit of time. So to clarify, the SABC initially said you can't do this transformation at all because it's our stuff. And now, most recently, they've been saying you can do it, but after you finish doing it, it'll belong to us. Something like that. I see Isaac wants to say something. Anyone else who wants to say something in this session, please put your hand up. Save any major legal interventions for the next session, but anything that's clarifying or adding to this conversation, there's a hand at the back. Press your mic, sir, and tap it, and let's see, and yourself, let's see if the mics are working up the back there. If not, I'm going to ask Jason to just grab another mic there, grab the red mic, and you can take it around the audience and people can pass it around. And I want Vukosi to tell us, just as we're getting the next two speakers ready, in 30 seconds, the anecdote, Vukosi, about what happened when you asked the government for the raw COVID data, and they said, no, you can only have the data embedded in a JPEG. They didn't even say you can have it in a PDF. They said you can have a JPEG with all of the numbers inside the JPEG and a graph, but you can't have the data. You said to them what? You said you tried to explain to them why you wanted the raw data.
Okay, so this is quickly on the other side of my data science hat of how do we make data available for research, and in this case, we're having a health catastrophe, and you want people to be able to do modeling. So the thing one would expect is it's easy, for aggregated data, not personal, not security issues, things that are shared every day by the minister would just be available, let's say, in an Excel file on a day-to-day basis. But there's this question of why do you want this that keeps on coming up, and then two, how would people know it comes from us? Right? Even though you would then say it will be available, there will be a reference of where the source is at all times, but there's this question of control of saying if this is from this province, it has to have the logo on it, it has to have, so it only gets released in these formats. And it's still we're in 2023 again, still something where if you ask and say for South Africa, where's the aggregated COVID data? Where can I get it and download it? That would be something that you'd be very surprised. You're probably going to get it from our lab, not from any other source, because there's these things of control that ultimately are impeding the way that we can actually do research. It's not our data. It's as I think from the point that it's facts about what happened during COVID.
Thanks, Vukosi. The mics that are being passed around, the handheld mics, you don't have to switch anything. Just when you start speaking, the sound team will switch them on. There's a gentleman at the back. There's Isaac. I think the mics nearer the front are working. Feel free to switch one on. Let's start with you, sir. Then we'll come to Isaac and the lady there. And we will come to all panelists for a final thought and word in the session.
Thank you to the speakers. On the issue of language, first of all, my name is Klaus Beiter. I'm a professor of law from Northwest University. The issue of language is very intricate because we must remember this is about also the preservation of languages And there is a term increasingly used, that of cultural genocide. I've written an article, yet to be published, where I use the term linguistic genocide. Now, this is a reality, and we know from the UN how many languages are there about to disappear. And South African native languages, we should be under no wrong impression, face the same kind of dilemma. The problem with the Berne Convention is it creates this right to translation for the translator. But one can make the argument that that actually violates, like, ius cogens, which is a principle of international law, and that for that reason, Article 8 is void, That is an argument I've made just to point out the importance of the ability to translate. We should remember that the CAB, which is hopefully coming into force, has got the fair use provision. As Ben said, translations are highly transformative. There was a decision of a US court in the 1850s, interesting, concerns the translation of an English work into German, and there was a copyright infringement brought before the court, and the court said, this is not a copyright infringement because you can only infringe copyright if you use a work, but translating a work is using the ideas, is not actually using the work. So, but since then, copyright has become ever more stringent. But we should remember this thing, that copyright, that translation, is highly transformative. And for that reason, the fair use provision would cover it. There is another provision in the CAB that deals with translation. And we need to broadly interpret that phrase within, a fair practice, that a translation is within the realms of fair practice. That needs to be interpreted widely, but it makes provision also for the advancement of culture, language, and education. So we should also keep that in mind.
Thank you so much for that. And there are 2 sessions tomorrow, one in the morning with Vukosi and Doug from Wikipedia, where they're going to dissect and go into more detail on the kind of licensing that public bodies, and arguably bodies like the SABC, which are publicly funded and operated by a public charter of some kind, ought to use, the licenses that they believe those institutions should use in making data available for translation or other purposes. And then in the afternoon, we're going to dissect in more detail where we're at with the Copyright Amendment Bill. And we'd love international visitors to come to that session as well to help us make sense of our progress and how we can sharpen our arguments. Let's come to Isaac and then the lady next to him.
Do you want me to use that mic?
I think it's okay. The mic is fine.
So, around 2008, the South African History Archives approached the SABC about about a joint project to make all the TRC material available to the public and to others who may be able to use it. Now, just to say that TRC material, so during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the SABC had a weekly program of around 30 minutes, and each of those would have 4 or 5 segments. And that program ran for about 4 years, so you can just think how many items. So effectively, what we've done with the SA History Archives was to re-edit all those programs, to isolate all those segments, so hundreds of them, and made it available on a website that is still available on, if you just search for SABC TRC, then you'll find it. And it's also available on YouTube directly. It's been used for reconciliation projects around the world for educational programs. It's been used in South African schools to teach children about the TRC, and it's generally available to the public. And I think that's a really good example of a project between the SABC and civil society to make material available that I think is in line with the mandate of the SABC in terms of public service. And I just hope that the same kind of thinking about working together to broaden language access to SABC content can also prevail in the efforts that Vukosi is trying to, in these efforts to try and get access to the material. Thank you.
And there's text and data mining in that database. I was the service provider on the first phase of the project, and we transcribed and indexed every program and put in a searchable text database for every bit of the TRC. I will say that working with Piers Pigu at the South African History Archive, to get the thing going in the first place, we did have to have a cup of tea with the education minister and get the education minister to phone the CEO of the SABC to unlock a few doors in the early stages of the project. But I agree with you 100%. It's a model project that we should repeat, and maybe Vukosi, you could get access to that and do a bit of work on translation of all of that into all the languages it's not yet translated into. The lady there, please. And then we're going to start to wrap up the session. We're going to come back one by one to all the speakers on the panel. I think there's one more person who had their hand up over there somewhere. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I'm Phoebe de Wet. I'm with the engineering faculty at the Northwest University in Potchefstroom. And for many years, I've been involved in developing speech technology for the indigenous languages of South Africa. So my history with the SABC goes back a little bit further than Vukosi's. And I know this is now between us and tea time, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but the very first time I wrote to the SABC was in 2004, when I started working as a researcher at Stellenbosch University. And this seems to be a recurring thing of approaching people to get access to data. And once or twice you're lucky and you speak to people who are really enthusiastic and they get carried away, and then somewhere the conversation stops. Something that's important to the work I do is labeled speech data. It's a very expensive resource to create, and I've always thought, well, people are generating speech in some places at such a tremendous rate. Why can't we use data that's already been generated? So one of the places I visited was National Parliament, and I had exactly the same experience as at the SABC. If you go to the archives, you pay 10 Rand, somebody gives you a slip in triplicate and you get 3 CDs, you know, then it works. As soon as you get to the level where you're asking for 200 or 500 or 1,000 hours of data, nobody wants to sign on the dotted line. Exactly. So I think often it's been a case of there's not somebody with expertise or power of authority who can sign on that dotted line and who knows the law and who's willing to sign on the dotted line and to take the risk for having signed on the dotted line. And we've tried this both ways. I mean, I started flying up to Joburg from Stellenbosch, going into the archives, finding that very special lady who looked for things for me. Once she retired, that line stopped. We illegally, and again, I think this is what I have in common with Christo, broke the law, put up an antenna on the lab in Stellenbosch and just started recording stuff from the radio. I have the data, it's been labeled, it's a very valuable resource, but nobody wants to make it available because to this day, nobody's been able to agree on what the legal status of the data is. I've asked, sorry, just 2 more things. I've asked a few high profile or let me call them respected law firms in the country. One of the answers that I keep getting, it's never been litigated in South Africa. So there's no Marivate versus the state to refer back to. And do you really want to be the first person to litigate this in South Africa?
Professor Marivate, you're under pressure to join the lawsuit. These are great stories. We really appreciate these stories. This is the session where we wanted to get these stories. We really appreciate. I'm going to move on.
I just want to make one more remark, and that's as an individual, as a researcher, starting my career at Stellenbosch University, I wrote to the SABC. Later, I was on ministerial panels in various state departments where we said, no, this is now going to be, top down, not bottom up. And it's now 17 years later, and I still have those CDs, I still have that database, unfortunately. And I was hoping now, our new hope now is for Vukosi to break down that wall. No pressure.
For the lawyers in the next session, you've got a lot of questions. The day the Copyright Amendment Bill comes into effect in South Africa, could everybody use that tagged, labeled resource that was recorded without permission, but with a lot of initiative in the days and the years before the arrival of the Copyright Amendment Bill? I want to come to our panel. There was one more hand I saw somewhere up there. Yep, go ahead. Please introduce yourself. Oh, they want you to use the handheld mics because the translation is only working with the handheld mics. She's got one. There is one there. You just start talking and then it comes on.
Okay, thank you. I am Malebake from VETS. So I've listened to the presentations and also the contributions from the floor as well. And I think for people who were frustrated with the conduct of SABC, I think you have given us an answer here, because many people, I think, are not aware, including myself. I only became aware at this point that really SABC is self-funded, so to speak. If you are going to get only 3% from the state, for your budget, that means you really have to fend for yourself. And I think you have to, as SABC management for that matter, you have to make sure that copyright works for you. And in that sense, you will have to make sure that you protect data, sometimes even things that you are not supposed to protect. So I think it has more to do with government handling SABC as a state entity that is serving the nation than the current situation where SABC is like a private entity that has to make profit. So again, that being said, I was a bit also perturbed to hear that SABC would give you permission to adapt certain of their works and eventually tell you that it actually belongs to them. And I'm thinking, what kind of arrangement is that? Thinking of licenses, I think that's a story for the lawyers for the next session as well. And
it's your session. You can't take any more of my session.
Yes, yeah. And lastly, really, I'm a copyright, specialist myself, and less so of human rights. And I cannot really, get into detail on the linkages between copyright and human rights. And listening to some of the interjections made, I think again, some of the bottlenecks don't have anything to do with copyright at all, like seeking data from the Department of Health. It's just, I think it's about just the attitude of saying no to everything, because if that data does not reveal any personal details, because again, remember, we still have POPI Act on the other hand, which would limit government in a sense that they cannot really divulge personal information or identifying information. But if data doesn't disclose any of personal information, but the officials say no to you, I think it has nothing to do with copyright, but them.
Point of order from the chair. I'm interrupting you. Is there such a thing as a point of order from the chair, or do you just interrupt? So I'm going to ask you to store the rest of those thoughts for your session, Malebake. Very useful, very, very important contribution there. Follow the money, you said. Well, I'm paraphrasing you. And let's think about this for a second. The opponents of copyright reform in South Africa use financial arguments, use economic arguments. They say if there is copyright reform, the publishing industry will be destroyed. The media houses, they don't particularly mention the SABC, but you know, the advocates in the front of the queue to oppose the Copyright Amendment Bill, I believe are those from MultiChoice, DSTV, the largest private network in the country, satellite broadcasting network, and then those sent over by the Motion Picture Association of America and others. And we know that streaming services like Netflix and others are not keen on the bill, either because it introduces fair royalties or because it introduces fair use, or both. And we disagree with all of that criticism. We disagree that the publishing industry will collapse. We disagree that any of those businesses will go out of business on the basis of a bit of copyright reform. But copyright does transform economic relations. And I think that's what we're learning from this conversation. Copyright reform does change economies. It does intervene in the financial, the business models of organizations like the SABC. It may cut off speculative revenue opportunities of a kind that Michael spoke about. And then we'd have to go back to our government and say, this is our SABC, we want you to fund it properly if we care about it. Let's go back to our panelists for one more word. I think I've abused the chair enough. When it comes to legal recourse, when it comes to getting the lawyers who are going to be ganging up on us in the next session to help us, what questions, what remaining questions do you want to throw their way? Or for that matter, what other reflections do you have on the difficulties you're facing in doing your work and how the law or anything else that we could do as a movement for copyright reform might help you with? Shall we go in reverse order of the initial speakers? So we'll come first to Christo and then Dr. Sao, and then we'll come to Angeline and Vukosi and Kathleen. Over to you, Christo.
Thank you. It sounds like, is this working? Can't hear it. It sounds like the University of Stellenbosch is a breeding ground of criminality. On a more serious note, we would really love to have a discussion with a lady from Northwest about TTS. When we applied to the Constitutional Court to have the Copyright Act of 1978 declared unconstitutional and to have Section 19D of the CAB read in to the Act to give it some respectability, the court found that Section 19D lacks in certain respects, so it would not give us quite what we wanted. It lacked certain definitions and so on. So the court dictated text that would give us what we needed. Now, in Prof. Owen Dean's reaction to the judgment, he used that as an argument to say that, well, the court found that 19D was flawed, so the whole of the CAB is then flawed. I think we could use that very same argument against him. Remember that only Section 19D has been tested by a court. So he cannot project that across the whole CAB and say it is unconstitutional. But if you use the argument against him, remember that only 2 sections of the Copyright Act of 1978 were tested by the court, and those were found to be unconstitutional. So it is likely that there might be many others also. Thank you.
Apologies to the other policymakers in the room from other countries. We're not planning litigation at this stage in any of your countries, only in our own at the moment. Let's go to Dr. Sao from Senegal.
Voilà, donc je vous remercie pour m'avoir invité à cette rencontre. Je voudrais également profiter de cette occasion pour dire
that developing countries need to be supported when it comes to have access to information, scientific and technical information, as well as their own data, because oftentimes the countries from elsewhere that come collect and get data from our continent, and they have access to data in our country, in our continent, sorry.
Donc nous
But
devons
we do
vraiment
not have
penser
the same privilege. So we need to think
sortir de
of
cette
coming out of this
néocolonialisme, parce que nous sommes toujours sous le
because
dictat
we are still
de certains pays
under that umbrella.
occidentaux
We still have
qui
that.
détiennent
We still
nos données.
under
Donc
that.
vraiment, c'est un souhait donc de voir que
if I can
tout le
call
monde
it a
en tout cas
colonialism
s'associe
system.
à
So
cette-
I
à ce
ask that
combat.
we should
Et
all
je
come
pense que
together
autour de ces genres
and
de rencontres,
fight
on
so that we
pourra en
can
discuter
then
davantage
we
et puis
should
essayer
have
de voir
equity,
la meilleure
data
stratégie pour
equity. So I would like us
de
to
ce-
work
de ce-
together in
de
order
ce
to get strategies
Voilà,
in
merci
order to come out of this issue and the challenge that we have in Africa. I would thank you all.
Will you possibly invite us to Dakar to have our next meeting
Ben
on
oui,
the right to research?
Absolument, oui, bien sûr que oui. Je
Yes,
pense que
definitely yes.
ça
I will
sera
definitely
dans
invite
les
you,
meilleurs délais.
and I believe it's going to be very, very soon.
Excellent. Let's go to Angeline. Thank you.
So I'd also like to thank IFL for the invitation. When it comes to climate change research, I think that's a completely different beast. Climate change is something that has a global cause, has a global impact, and we will need global intervention. And I think one of the things that we constantly hear about climate change is this tipping point analogy. So we're either close to the tipping point, we're at the tipping point, or we're over the tipping point, we're on a cliff or in the abyss or somewhere in between. But there's a sense of urgency that comes with that. And I think when we are weighing the two competing interests of people who develop and create data sets or platforms that may be used in this type of research, I understand that they have a right to ownership and a right to determine how those tools and data is used. But when you're weighing that against the sense of urgency that we are looking at when it comes to climate change and the real world impacts of that, I think maybe there needs to be a rethinking when it comes to the laws that govern that kind of access to data or access to the tools that are used in this research. So personally, I feel like when it comes to AI climate research or any kind of climate research, I believe that we should have the broadest options available to us in terms of access. I think personally, I keep saying personally because I know I'm in a room full of lawyers. Personally, I think we should be able to have access to all the data, and that should be standard across the board. Because again, if this is a global, if it's global causation and global impact and needs global intervention, we need to be able to work with our colleagues in Africa and also our international colleagues. So what that means on a legal sense, I'm sure we will learn in the next session. But personally, I think data for all when it comes to climate research, at least.
Excellent. Don't let the lawyers get you down, especially the ones here are a friendly bunch. I'd like to ask in the control room if you can queue up the second video clip. We're going to end this session with a 2.5-minute little video, which is a preview of what's to come today. And people are already saying their thanks, but this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's another 4 or 5 days, and tomorrow many of these conversations will continue. Who's next? Vukosi.
Yeah, I think one thing is always to also remember why we do the things. We didn't come to this through copyright. We came through this through working on language, working on really representing our languages, our local languages, and whether that's through here at the University of Pretoria or through Masakhane and all the other organizations that we work with. So I think with this, it's great that we're having these types of engagements and we're looking to really get it done and really move move forward in better understanding and also better collaboration. From our side, actually, just to show in terms of what happens if you do make things accessible and available for research, our lab here at the university will be releasing, hopefully by next Friday, the 3rd of February, two new data sets. So one being the government speeches from South Africa, all of they're translated into the cabinet speeches into 11 languages, and we've been working to actually process that information and make it easy for researchers to actually use, and it will then be available to the point where it's also going to be aligned with many of the languages per sentence. So you will actually be able to see one sentence in all of the 11 languages. What innovators do with it after, we'll see. And that's the thing that excites me a lot. And the second one, as another example, is the Vukosi publication that comes from the Government Communications Service. They publish twice a month a government a newspaper. Let's say it has 10 articles in English, only 2 of them or 3 of them would actually be translated. And what we've done is actually gone through the PDFs because we couldn't get access to the more softer files. We've gone through the PDFs, and students have been working, interns have been working, members of the lab have been working to actually extract as much of that and actually align it as well. So that's also going to become available. And already, even before it became kind of now officially available, we had another group from inside Masakhane contact us and say, oh, we want to work on Chivenda. And we found this. I think that when they were asking this at that time, they didn't know it was coming from me. And then I was like, oh yeah, that's actually the data that comes from our lab, and we're actually going to be updating more from this. And they're building now a named entity recognition tool for Chivenda, and that's exactly why you make the data available in an open way. Then the innovation builds on top of that, and then we can also work on making sure that our languages are counted.
I've got an idea, Vukosi. We'll have to talk about it outside of this forum. But you and me were in a shrinking minority of people who are excited about anything to do with cabinet speeches. But we're doing a youth TV show on politics and young people's reflections on politics. Maybe we could search through those cabinet speeches in different languages and see the contradictions between what they were saying 10 years ago and what they are saying now, and play with it to music or, in other formats. So we have something to talk about. That's definitely transformative.
So this conversation has made me think of a project that is perhaps circumventing copyright at a programmatic level. They're coincidentally working in a similar space in terms of seeking machine translation data, and they're scraping it currently from religious websites that has access to several different languages. And because one researcher has gone ahead and done this, but then they cannot publish the data set that they have scraped, what they have done is published instead the scripts that they use to scrape the website, such that if you as an individual are interested in the data for your own purposes, you can actually take the scripts, adapt them to your use case, and then use the data for your own personal consumption. And I assume that as that the original data owner, or the copyright owner, created this material for an individual's consumption. So technically, there's no copyright infringement in that case, I think. I don't know. But
that is so cool. I mean, we're ending this session with the coolest things. Vukosi, you don't need to do the thing and then the SABC will own it. Don't publish it. Publish the program that creates it and let everybody recreate it on their own PC. Yeah. Isn't that cool? That's the answer, people. We don't need the law. Okay, coming next, please play our 2-minute clip which previews what's coming in the rest of the conference.
One of the things that's really clear to me in looking at text and data mining is that it is being used all the time, more or less, pretty universally against us.
Ask yourself what role you want to be within the research system. Do you only want to be the subject of research, or do you want to be the agent doing the research?
So who has the ability to either license the databases that they're using or run the risk of using a lot of databases and maybe being liable later. That's just the major players.
Governments and many large corporations, increasingly mid-sized corporations.
Large movie studios, to pick one example, have access to exactly the kind of work that we'd love to be able to do to analyze the biases that they make so much money off of.
What language should I translate to?
Most of the people that conduct this research in high-tech institutions with all the resources and infrastructure are in the global north. But when they are able to mine data, they do that without any limitation to geography.
When you look at the world of research exceptions, you find that the poorest countries often have the least ability to engage in research.
I find it very troubling that so many countries in Latin America are red.
There is a fundamental power imbalance globally. Whether you're talking about climate change research or whether you are talking about research relating to medicines.
So one of the big challenges is to make it possible for people to see the way that artificial intelligence will affect their day-to-day life. Not just researchers, policymakers, but also ordinary people.
You can, by way of computational technologies, sequence the genetics of even a medicinal plant somewhere in Africa and upload it, and everybody anywhere in the world can access it from their fancy laboratories.
Ultimately, what I think matters is that we have diverse participation.
When you begin to develop these policies, begin to think critically about those who are not optimally participating in this space, but whose data are unwillingly, inevitably adapted into this space as well.
I find it troubling that this is not a top priority in the discussion of artificial intelligence.
No copyright asserted on this film. We will make it freely available if anybody finds it useful to use in their advocacy work and so on. Produced, of course, with support from PIGIP and the other funders of this conference. Thank you. See you in 15 minutes after tea for the next session. That makes it 12 o'clock.